All right, so where are we? We're in the book of Genesis. Like I said, Genesis is obviously the first book in the Bible, and it is a book that we see that is basically telling of people's lives in narrative form. And the person we are going to be looking at today is a man by the name of Abraham, who had his faith put to the test. And I believe that the test that he was put to only had one question, and that question is actually what I've titled today's message. So if you're taking notes, I've titled today's message, Do You Trust Him? And we're going to be looking at the first 19 verses of chapter 22. But before we dive into this section of Scripture, I believe that it is important to give us some context on the passage that we're going to be looking at today. It's been said that when you read a text without context, it can become a pretext, and that is not what we want to do. So I want to emphasize the point that context is important, and so I would like to kind of set the stage of where we are in the book of Genesis this morning. Now, many of you have probably heard of this man by the name of Abraham in the Bible. According to Genesis chapter 12, there was a covenant between him and God, and that God would make Abraham the father of many nations. Is a big promise, and God made that with Abraham in chapter 12, and then going on through that, we see a narrative of his life play out. Another reason you might be familiar with Abraham is maybe from Sunday school. They gave him his own song. So that song is Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. Right arm, and so on from there. Anyway, I'm not going to sing the whole song, but you get the picture. So Genesis again, is a depiction of Abraham's life in narrative form. We see that here. And if you look to the left a little bit, we see what is going on and what's happening in Abraham's life before we get to chapter 22. So if you need to turn to the page to the left a little bit, in chapter 21, there's three main life events that we see going on with Abraham here. In the first, starting in verse 1, we see this birth of Isaac. His second son is born, Isaac, and that is a big deal in and of itself because Abraham and his wife Sarah were old. Really old. We're talking like 100 years old and 90 years old, respectively. So they were old. They were well past the age in which childbearing is possible. And so the only way that they were going to have a child at their age was if God intervened. I know it's been said that age is just a number, and while that is true, I think we can all pretty much agree that even if Sarah was young at heart, there was nothing that she could do to have a son at her age apart from the Lord. And so we see that here. Isaac is born. And then the next thing we see is Isaac's first son, Ishmael, departs and leaves the family. Ishmael and his mom Hagar are a completely different part of Abraham's story that I'm not really going to go into too much today. I will make mention of him a few times in our text, but we're not going to dive into their story. But the important part that happens in chapter 21 with Ishmael and his mom is they kind of basically get written out of the will. They depart, they leave the family, and they are no longer considered a part of the family. They're gone, they leave, and we see that play out in verses 8 through 21. And then finally, the last thing we see in chapter 21 is we see a conflict that takes place between Abraham and one of the local leaders by the name of Abimelech. The conflict ends up getting resolved, and Abimelech and Abraham make a covenant together, and they work out a deal because the grievance was that Abraham was in this land, and Abimelech didn't want him there, and so they work it out, and they settle the fact that Abraham will be allowed to dwell in this land by the name of Beersheba. Beersheba is in Israel, and it is a place that you can go to visit today. It's still a place that is inhabited and places that you can go to visit. And then in the end of chapter 21, in verse 34, it says, Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. So he stayed there in Beersheba for many days, and many days can be a little bit deceiving, for the lack of a better word. It can be equated to actually many years. A lot of scholars who are a lot smarter than me have determined that many days in that verse actually mean years. And so we see that between the chapter 21, verse 1, all the way through the end there, about 15-ish years take place. Okay, so we get to the passage where we are today, and we have Abraham, who's now about 115 or so years. He's certainly not getting younger, and now he has a teenager in Isaac, and they're kind of chilling, minding their own business there in Beersheba, and things are going great. And then all of a sudden, we walk into the scene that we have here in in chapter 22. We're going to be looking at the first 19 verses, like I said, and I've broken it up into 4 different points. Since it's a lot of verses, I'm not going to read them all at once. We'll just kind of go through them as we make our way through the text. But our first point is, you want me to do what? And so that'll make more sense after we read the first 2 verses. So if you will look with me in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, it says this. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then the Lord said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Okay, so after these things is the first part of verse 1. And it says, after these things, well, after what things? The things that we just got done talking about, right? We got done talking about the 3 big life events in Abraham's life. And now we're in chapter 22 after those things had happened, right? So Isaac was born. Ishmael left and is out of the family, and then the whole thing goes down with Abimelech. And now we're here. He's minding his own business, and God decides that it is time to test Abraham, and he said his name. He called his name out, Abraham. I like what Abraham's response here is, because he says, Behold, here I am. That's how it is in the old school King James Version. I like that because it sounds like he's like, Here I am, Lord, right away. Like, boom, he snaps right up and he says, Hi, I'm right here. What's up, God? How can I help you? You know, and he perks right up and directly listens. I like the fact that his response is immediate. I don't know if you've ever tried to get somebody's attention before, and you have to say their name many, many times before they actually hear what you're trying to say. I fill in for Pastor Brett at youth group when he is not able to come, and I know that I've experienced that with some of our youth students, where I'll say their name many, many times before they are paying attention. But that was definitely not the case here with Abraham. He right away, as soon as the Lord said his name, he said, Here I am. A response that was important. Now, you have to remember, Abraham was 100 years of age, or actually a little bit past 100 years of age now. He's well into his early 100s. And, so he's old, and he may be a little bit hard of hearing, and there certainly wasn't things called hearing aids back in his time. So I believe that when God called his name, it was pretty epic. It was like a good old Abraham, something that got his attention right away, and so much so that it encouraged him to say, like, right away, here I am, Lord. I think that his response is interesting to note. His response was interesting to note because it was important to him to react to the Lord calling his name, to show a sign of respect to him, to show a sign that what he was being called by the Lord, and he didn't take that lightly. So then in verse 2, we see the test of faith, what the test of faith is going to look like. He told Abraham to take his only son, Isaac, to the land of Moriah. Now, Mount Moriah is in modern-day Jerusalem. You may have heard of Mount Moriah before. It has significance in another Bible story, a story that is known as the story of Jesus Christ and his crucifixion. Mount Moriah, or the Moriah mountain range, is also where Golgotha or Calvary is. The mountain where the cross was, where Jesus was crucified. So we're going to see a lot of different parallels between the story of Jesus and the story that we have here in Genesis chapter 22 today. And that is one of the first ones we see, is it's the same mountain range. It might not have been the exact same spot per se, but it was definitely in the same area, the same mountain range. Mount Moriah was where this took place. And then the angel, or God, tells Abraham to take his only son. And that might sound familiar if you know the passage of John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, right? His only son to die on the earth for our sins. That's the same situation. His only son here is Isaac. And he's telling him to take his only son up to Mount Moriah. Now, the part where it says only son here is a little bit confusing to some readers, because you might be thinking, well, I thought we were just talking in chapter 21 about Ishmael, who is his firstborn son. And yes, that is true. Ishmael is, in fact, Abraham's firstborn son, but his mom is Hagar. In other words, his mom is not Sarah. And what happened in chapter 21 is they were basically, again, written out of the will. They were along their merry way. They left, and they did not they weren't considered a part of the covenant between God and Abraham, because Sarah was to be the one to produce the son for Abraham. And so that's why it says only son there, is because Isaac was Abraham and Sarah's only son. So now that we got that cleared up, we know that I believe that Abraham got to a point after he had heard the Lord speak to him and tell him what was going to happen. Even if it was for a moment, he thought to himself, you want me to do what? Wait a second, you just promised me that I was going to become a father of many nations, and that I was going to have a son in my old age, and that happened, and that was awesome, and things are going great. And now all of a sudden you want me to do what? You want me to sacrifice him? You want me to kill him? How is that going to happen, right? Even if that was a fleeting thought, just for a moment's time, I think that might have been something that Abraham was feeling inside of his heart, because he could have been a little confused at that moment, right? Not understanding, like, this is your covenant, God, this is your promise to me that I'm going to become a father of many nations, but if Isaac is dead, how is that going to happen? But I see here that Abraham has way more faith than I did. I would have if I were in his shoes. Because we see in the next set of verses, in our next point, actually, verses 3 through 8, we're going to see where Abraham's response to what the Lord had told him to do is, okay, let's do this, right? So we're going to read now verses 3 through 8. verses 3 through 8 says, "And so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took his 2 young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to a place which God had told him." Verse 4, "Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey and the lad, and I will go yonder and worship. And we,'" underline that word, that's important, "we will come back to you." So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife and spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look at the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Verse 8 says, "And Abraham said, 'My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering.' So the 2 of them went together." So in verse 3, we see that he gets up early. In other words, he didn't hit the snooze button on his alarm clock. It was one of those things where he got right up, and I believe that his first thought was, "Okay, let's do this. Let's do what the Lord has commanded me to do." I don't know if you've ever had one of those mornings where you go to bed and you know the next day is going to be stressful. Then your alarm clock goes off and you hit the snooze button and you're like, maybe I'll just unplug my alarm clock and stay in bed, right? Because if that happens, then you don't have to deal with the stressful day that you know is going to be coming before you. And Abraham very well could have done that in this situation. He could have not gotten up early and not done what the Lord had told him to do. But instead, his first thought was, okay, we're going to do this, and I'm going to listen to what the Lord has commanded me to do. So he may not have had a good idea of how the Lord was going to work out all the details, but he trusted that God would indeed work out the details and show him and provide for him a way for what he had commanded him to do to take place. So then in verse 4 it says, "On the 3rd day." Again, another familiar phrasing, because if you remember in the story of Jesus, after he was crucified on the 3rd day, he was risen again. He rose again. So there we have another parallel between this story that we have in Genesis chapter 22 and the story of Jesus. Okay, so now at this point, I want to point out something that I believe is very important. In verse 5, I had you remember and note the word "we." It's just a 2-letter word, but it's an important word. I think it's very significant. The reason I think that it's significant is because Abraham trusted that God was going to keep his covenant to make him a father of many nations. I believe that he had expectant faith, knowing that God said it was going to happen, so it was going to happen, right? So he knew that if he was to follow what the Lord had told him to do, that the Lord was going to provide a different way to make him the father of many nations. I believe that this, again, is expectant faith, expecting that God will work out the details of this extremely scary task that the Lord had commanded him to do. I believe that he fully expected that if the Lord wasn't going to provide a different means of sacrifice for this burnt offering, that he would have perhaps brought Isaac back to life so that his covenant with Abraham could have been fulfilled. And so Isaac would have been brought to life after the fact, if in fact he was killed. But spoiler alert, in the next set of verses, we're going to see that he doesn't actually have to endure death in this burnt offering situation. But in verse 6, we see that Abraham gave Isaac the wood to carry up to the mountain. And yet we have another parallel between our story today and the story of Jesus Christ. Because Christ had to, in fact, carry wood up on the same Mount Moriah, the wooden cross up to the crucifixion. And here we have Isaac going to be sacrificed, and he is now carrying his wood up to the top for the burnt offering. So there's another parallel there. And I think it's interesting that what we see here, because I kind of like what's happening in verse 7. Isaac was looking around, and he was perhaps going through his burnt offering checklist, and he was like, okay, we got the wood, check, I'll carry that. Next, Dad, if you get the fire and the knife, we're good there. But then he's looking around, and he's like, there's no lamb, right? So he's like, hey, Dad, I think we're missing something. But then in verse 8, we see Abraham's expectant faith again demonstrated. We see that he trusted that the Lord would provide a lamb. So I'm going to read verse 8 again. It says, Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. So the two of them went together. He may not have known how the Lord was going to provide, whether that was Isaac himself or a different way, but he expected that either way, it was going to happen. He believed that when God says something is going to happen, i.e. a sacrifice like this, what he commanded Abraham to do, he believed that it was going to happen no matter what. And he trusted the Lord so much that he was able to display that to his son here. You know, because if it wasn't about, again, I want to point out that it wasn't about the scariness of the situation for Abraham. He might have been terrified. Okay, he might have been feeling freaked out. He might have been feeling stressed. He might have been feeling worried or whatever. There's a whole range of emotions he could have been feeling there, but it wasn't about what he was feeling. Okay, it was about what he knew. And he couldn't explain exactly how it was going to happen, but God said that he would provide a lamb. And he knew that God would provide a sacrifice either way. And he knew that he knew that if the Lord said it was going to happen, it was going to happen. It reminds me of another parallel to Jesus' story in John chapter 1, verse 29, when John the Baptist is there, and he says, behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. Speaking of Jesus. Now, did John the Baptist know exactly how the sins of the world were going to be taken away at that point? I don't know. I speculate that I would believe that he didn't know exactly how it was going to happen. He didn't know exactly how it was going to go down. He just knew that Jesus was who he said he was and that it was going to happen. So again, we see expectant faith displayed here, and yet another parallel to the story of Jesus in our story today. Okay, so it's at this point that if I were Isaac, I probably would have bailed. Right? In my mind, I equate this to maybe packing for a trip. I don't know if any of you like to travel. I love to travel, but one of the things I like the least about traveling is packing. I can't stand it. It's literally the worst. So I always procrastinate it until like the day of departure, and I'm running around gathering everything, and then I end up forgetting something, and then it's a whole thing. But let's pretend for a minute that I'm not a procrastinator, and that I was packing the night before, or a couple days before even, and I have a list, and I'm going through it, and I say, okay, I need my toothbrush, I need clean clothes, I need my phone charger, and I'm good. And then I get to the suitcase itself to put all my other stuff in, and I don't have that. I'm not going to say, well, the Lord will provide a suitcase for me for my trip, right? I'm probably going to go to make a quick Target run and figure out if they have any luggage and figure out something to put all my stuff in before I go. But that's not what happened in this case, where Isaac was going down the burnt offering checklist, and he realizes, okay, we have nothing to actually sacrifice. We have all the stuff to do it, minus the actual important part of the sacrifice. And he might have been thinking like, well, if Dad's doing the sacrifice, then what does that leave me? right? So he brings it up. He brings this concern up to his dad, and he's like, Dad, I think we're forgetting something. But Abraham then tells him, the Lord will provide. And so then it says there at the end there that they went together, and the two of them proceeded to go through with it. And what I think that shows is I think that shows remarkable honor on Isaac's part to his father. He was honoring what his father was telling him to do. Just like Pastor Fernando was talking about last week, about honoring your father and mother, I think this is a good example of how a son was honoring his father and doing what he was telling him to do. Right? But when they had this conversation about the Lord providing, that was it. It was settled, and they were in agreement to go. He didn't bail. He was a young teenage kid. He could have, he had a long life ahead of him. But he trusted as much as his dad did that the Lord was going to provide, and we see that here. Because again, they both believed and were in agreement that if the Lord said something was going to happen, that it was going to happen. That leads us then into our third point, where we're leading up to it now, and now it's actually happening. It's happening, okay? So now in verses 9 through 14, we see how it plays out. So let's pick up in verse 9. It says, Then they came to the place where God had told them, and Abraham built an altar there, placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son, and laid him, and stretched out his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. Verse 11, But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Verse 14. Then Abraham called the name of this place, The Lord Will Provide, as it was said, to this day, the mount of the Lord shall be provided. So we see that Abraham had gone so far, he had gone this far, and he was willing to go through with it, right? When Isaac and him were going through the checklist, he could have accidentally forgotten the knife for the sacrifice, right? Or perhaps he would have accidentally forgotten the fire to do the burnt sacrifice, but he didn't. Okay, he brought everything. He was obedient to what the Lord had commanded him to do, and he came like this close, right? And I picture it like just like right there, like that close, and then all of a sudden, verse 11 happens, right? And the angel of the Lord called out, Abraham, Abraham. And this is my interpretation, but I envision Isaac just with a big sigh of relief, like, whew, that was a close one. Right? But Abraham trusted God so much that he was willing to do what he commanded him to do because the Lord's will, that was the Lord's will. And so he was wanting to be in the Lord's will, in obedience to this commandment from God. He was willing to make the sacrifice in obedience to God's will. And he was willing to go so far as to kill his son, the son whom he was promised that would make him the father of many nations, because he believed so much that God was going to uphold his end of the covenant and make him a father of many nations. He knew that God was going to do that, but he knew that this commandment, if the Lord was telling him to do it, was what the Lord's will was, and he wasn't going to step outside of that. A theologian by the name of Donald Barnhouse said this when it was talking about the will of God. And I'm going to read the quote because I think it is a good way to put it. Often there are believers who wonder how they may know the will of God. We believe that 90% of knowing the will of God consists of willingness to do it before it is actually known. And I think Abraham wasn't 90% of committed to this situation, right? Because he was there. He was on his way down to, stab or kill Isaac to do the sacrifice. And then right at the last second, the angel called out to his name. He was 100% in. He was all in before he even knew what the exact will of the Lord was in this situation. The bottom line here is that Abraham and Isaac, for that matter, were both willing to submit to the will of God, and they had unwavering trust in his provision, whatever that may have looked like. So moving to verse 13, we see that God provided a ram. And again, I'm guessing here, this is just speculation on my part, but I think that if Abraham wasn't all bound up on the altar, he probably would have gone over and kissed that ram on the lips. He had probably never been so happy to see a ram in his life, right? But he was there, and then the ram was the sacrifice, and it was all good, right? And the Lord did provide, just like he said he was going to. In fact, in verse 14, we see that Abraham called this place that this was all going down. In Hebrew, it is translated as Jehovah Jireh or Yahweh Yireh. And that means what it says in the King James Version, the Lord will provide. So that then leads us to our last point in verses 15 through 19, that obedience equals blessing. So we're going to read the rest of this passage here. Picking up in verse 15, it says, Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and you have withheld your son, your only son, blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand of which are on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Verse 18, In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to the young men, and they rose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt in Beersheba. So we see here the result of Abraham's willingness to trust the Lord. When I say the word trust, I want to clarify something, because I think when I say trust, I want you to understand what I mean by that. I'm not necessarily conforming to the world's definition of trust, but I trust in the Lord is what I'm talking about here. And so I looked up the word trust on dictionary.com, and it was defined as this: trust is a firm belief in the reliability, trust, ability, or strength of someone to do something. Okay, I mostly agree with that definition of trust, but I would define the trust in the Lord as a little bit different. I would define it as this: trust in the Lord is a firm faith in the reliability, truth, and ability and the strength of the Lord to accomplish his will. I'm going to say that again because I think it's important. Trust in the Lord is a firm faith in the reliability, truth, ability, and strength of the Lord to accomplish his will. Okay? With that idea and definition of trust there, I believe that's how Abraham approached this situation. Okay? I believe that Abraham could answer that question that I posed as the message title, do you trust him, as a resounding yes, 100%. He trusted that God had the ability and the strength to accomplish his will through Abraham and Isaac, regardless of how it was going to play out. The details weren't important. He knew and trusted that the Lord was going to do what he said he was going to do. I believe that he did, in fact, say yes to that question, do you trust him? Look at verse 17 again. He trusted that the Lord, and he was obedient to his commands. And what did that result in? That resulted in a blessing. A blessing not only for Abraham, but for his whole bloodline. And if you think about it, his bloodline actually leads us to Jesus Christ. The very bloodline of Jesus Christ was started here with Abraham and all the way through. If you look and you turn to Matthew chapter 1, you don't need to turn there, but you can look at it afterwards. You will see at the beginning where it talks about Abraham, and it goes all the way through the lineage of Jesus all the way here. So he blessed this bloodline from this scenario, from this situation, because of Abraham's faith. So again, we have yet another parallel between Jesus and Jesus' story and our story here of Abraham sacrificing, or not so much sacrificing Isaac, but being obedient to what the Lord had commanded him to do. Isn't that amazing? I love how, let's see here. I love how the passage ends. Okay, we look at verse 19 again, and it talks about those young men. The young men that they left in verse 5, it says, "We will come back to you." And they did, right? They came back full circle. They did what the Lord had commanded them to do. The Lord provided, and they went back, and they dwelt in the land of Beersheba, and all was good. But what I want to point out is something that I came across when I was studying that I thought was really cool that I guess I'd never really realized before. I want you to notice something in verse 19. At the beginning it says, "So Abraham returned." And I want you to notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say Abraham and Isaac returned. It just says, "So Abraham returned." Isn't that interesting? I mean, it's clearly obvious that Isaac survived this whole ordeal, right? The whole ram situation. The ram was in the thicket. They came and they did that sacrifice. So Isaac was still alive. He made it. And he again trusted in the Lord so much. And he told the guys, Abraham told the guys, "We'll be back." And in fact, they were. But in verse 19, it just says Abraham. And I thought to myself, well, why does it just say Abraham? And then as I was studying, saw that that's actually a beautiful picture that's painted there. And I think it's done on purpose. I believe that there is nothing said about Isaac here for the simple fact that that wasn't necessarily, the whole situation wasn't about Isaac in that moment. It was about Abraham's faith and listening to him. Now, there was a lot of faith involved on Isaac's part as well, but that's not what it was about. And then Isaac isn't mentioned again in Genesis until 2 chapters later in chapter 24, verse 62, which is when he is seen meeting his bride. Okay, so while it is obvious that Isaac did return home with his father, the Bible here in verse 19 reminds us that the next event on Jesus Christ's calendar is when he comes back to claim his bride, the church. Isn't that cool? How it kind of parallels there together. So again, we see the so many different parallels between this story and Jesus' story and how they're intertwined. But I think it's an amazing passage for us to really glean a lot of truths from. And in closing, by way of application, I want to take this passage of Scripture and kind of apply it in two different ways. And the first way, I would say, is we must trust the Lord even when it seems scary. I don't really think that if I were in Abraham's shoes, I would have found it as easy peasy as he did. He right away responded to the Lord, said, "Here I am." He right away got up early the next morning and did what the Lord was telling him to do. When Isaac presented him with the problem of not having a lamb for the sacrifice, he said, "God's got it." And we see all throughout that situation, he was willing to do it, and he came this close, but he didn't do it. And that, in my opinion, seeing that play out in my brain is a very scary situation. But he trusted the Lord so much with that definition of trust that I gave earlier that he knew that if God was going to make him the father of many nations, that even if Isaac was killed in the sacrifice, that he was going to work another miracle to do what he was going to do, what he said he was going to do. I believe that we see an unwavering trust in God there and an unexpected faith in God's will. Accomplishing the will of the Lord isn't always going to be easy. In fact, there are times when it's going to be downright hard or even scary, like this situation here. But we can know and have comfort in the fact that even when it's scary, we are to lean into our faith. We look at Abraham's faith and how he trusted the Lord in this situation. It wasn't about his emotional state. It wasn't about what he was feeling, the thought of scariness in his heart. It was about what he knew was true. He trusted the Lord. And for us, when a situation comes up and it seems scary, we have to rely on the trust of the Lord like Abraham did. We can use him as an example. Because if we don't and we bail out of the situation, that can end up very poorly. Just think about what would have happened if Abraham bailed and didn't do what the Lord had commanded him to do. We wouldn't have gotten to Jesus Christ. And we all know what would have happened if Jesus didn't come to this earth. We wouldn't have been able to be saved from our sin. But Abraham was obedient and he trusted in the Lord, even though the situation was scary. And we can use that example of Abraham's life to know that we can have that same trust in the Lord. And then moving on to our final application point, we must be ready when the Lord tests our faith. We aren't always going to know when the Lord is going to test our faith next. But we can know that a test of our faith is inevitable. It's going to happen. And we need to be ready and eager like Abraham was. Okay, look how it worked out for Abraham. It landed him in Hebrews chapter 11, which has been dubbed the Hall of Faith. In the New Testament, it talks about the faith of Abraham, which happened in Genesis, right? So all throughout the time of the whole Bible, he's mentioned in the New Testament about how amazing his faith was. And so he was ready when the Lord tested his faith. And in the same way, I believe that we need to be ready. Well, the question is, how do we do that? I don't know about you, but personally, I've never been a good test taker. So how am I ready for a test when I don't even know when it's coming, A, but B, I'm not good at tests anyway. When I was in school and I knew of a test was coming up, I would study, and then cram the day before, and then get to the test and not remember anything that I studied. And then I would kind of panic and then just start circling things on the multiple choice and praying that the Lord would work it out. Sometimes he did, other times he didn't. But that's not important. What is important is that Abraham was ready for this test. The one question test of did you trust him? Did Abraham trust the Lord? And I believe he did. And we can do that too. But it's not going to be easy, and we need to be ready. When the test comes where it is perhaps a cancer diagnosis, or you lose your job, or you're having financial issues and you can't pay your mortgage for this month, we have a choice on how to react to that. Are we going to panic, or are we going to trust? And that's not easy, but we need to be ready. And what we can do is we can look to the Lord in the faith of Abraham in this situation. And when we're faced with a test of our faith, we can say, I trust you, Lord. And the reason we can do that is because even in a situation where perhaps you have a cancer diagnosis, and let's say the worst happens, the cancer takes your life, guess what? Jesus paid for your sins, and you would be able to spend eternity with him. Jesus paid for it all. So no matter how bad it gets here, this is the worst as it's going to get because we have the promise of heaven. And all we have to do is accept that free gift into our hearts. So I would encourage you today that if you have never accepted Jesus into your heart, I'm going to pray in just a moment. about accepting Jesus into your heart. But if you have, I would challenge you to look to this story of Abraham and Isaac and have that bold trust in the Lord that he is going to accomplish his will through your life. And if he says it's going to happen, it's going to happen.